All right, today is December the 19th in 2025, and my guest is Ruxandra Teslo. Ruxandra is a genomics PhD blogger on Substack, where you find her writings under her name, and a writer also for the clinical trial Abundance Project. Ruxandra is one of the most prolific and thoughtful contemporary researcher on biotech innovation. I say that as someone who's been following her writing for a while now, and really looking forward to this conversation. Welcome, Ruxandra.
Thank you. Thank you. That's very generous. Hopefully I live up to that description.
Sure. Anything to add to the introduction about you and what you're working on or what your background is?
Yeah, so I actually finished my PhD very recently, and I'm going to move on to working full time on figuring out how to do better clinical trials. And um, you know, something that I would really like to people to remember is that, when we talk about better clinical trials, what we really mean is unleashing medical innovation. So what we ultimately want is not really just to have clinical trials for the sake of it. Just see it as a key bottleneck in like actually realizing sort of biomedical abundance. So, what I ultimately want is not just more clinical trials. I want, better and more drugs. So that's kind of the aim at the end of the day.
That's like that. We have that as a shared goal, right? So regular listeners of this podcast know that I'm working on many of these ideas directly, right? So I live in Prospera and we have a biomedical innovation hub there. And we're bringing some of these into the United States as well right now as we speak. Ruxandra, you have researched this topic at a level of depth that I'm very tempted to nerd out for hours with you about. For sure, you know a lot more than I do. But I really want to make sure we're taking our listeners on the journey with us because it's a very deep rabbit hole. It's very complex, and a lot of these things, as you point out in some of your writings, haven't ever been researched that much, right? So to start off with, for the uninformed but curious person listening, why should we care about clinical trials and drug development? You already mentioned we care about biomedical innovation. But what role do they play in biomedical innovation? How do they actually work, right? And what are the common kind of misunderstandings about clinical trials?
Yeah, great. Yeah, no, that's a very good question. So, basically, a drug development program takes about 10 years. More or less depends on the type of drug, but that's kind of a ballpark and can cost like upwards of $1 billion. Again, estimates vary. Some people say average 2 billion, some people say average 1.2, but like, enormous amounts of money. A lot of that time, like 60 to 70%, is spent in something called clinical development that includes clinical trials where drugs are tested in humans, but also all the ancillary processes to clinical trials. So basically, manufacturing. So like the manufacturing that happens during clinical trials, slightly different than manufacturing that happens after you are approved. Um, and just everything that is done to support clinical trials. So that's why I call it. So basically, it's really about clinical development, but that's a bit of a term that like people are not that used to. So I just call it clinical trials. But really, I refer to everything that happens once you start interacting with the FDA and once you start like basically using your drug to like test it in people. And the other thing is that, so we care about them because they're such a major like blocker in terms of money and in terms of time spent. We also care about them because they're not really something that you can bypass. And the probability that you would get a drug that, just when you start with the drug, the probability that it will get FDA approved is around 10%. Again, varies by area, and that's largely because it fails in human clinical trials, either efficacy, most of them, or safety. And we haven't really found a way to like reliably predict from other types of models, you know, uh, which drugs will succeed and how well they will work. And I mean, we can talk about this. Like, I totally support initiatives to like sort of increase so-called predictive validity, so our ability to sort of predict a priori why will work and why will not work, so that we can waste less of these resources on like unhelpful drugs. But I also think that to be completely realistic, we will never I don't, well, not never, but like I don't see it in like the near future, in like the medium future, really, that we will be able to bypass human trials. And I think that basically the a misconception about them is that I think people conflate a lot of, like, the term clinical trials is just very broad. So you have everything from like an N of like 2 patients tested in the clinic with a new therapy. That's a clinical trial because you have to like, because you're basically introducing like an interventional thing in humans. But, like also, and that's usually organized by like academics trying something new. So that gets pinned as a clinical trial. But then people also refer to like 1,000 patient phase 3 trials. So phase 3 is like the sort of like final form of trial where you do it for final approval. They also refer to that as a clinical trial. And in some sense, that's correct, but in some sense, they're just very different and they sort of serve different functions. And actually, one of the and this is important because one of the sort of criticisms that I got after I released my, just let's make clinical trials more efficient and faster, was that I am sort of accepting biotech as a sort of casino, and like I'm accepting the status quo of like really low success rates, and I'm not trying to make it better. So first of all, I think that you can do both at the same time. Like I don't think they're mutually exclusive, but I think a more subtle point here is that especially smaller trials, I don't see them as like separate from like the process of scientific discovery. Like if you look at the history of medical innovation, there's this thing called that Jacques Canal, which I co-wrote recently an article about, and he's written a lot about predictive validity. There's this thing called clinical evolution. So basically, your inhuman data is so valuable and so irreplaceable that it's not a something separate that just happens at the end like of a drug development program. It's not just the 1,000 phase 3 trial that you have at the end. Really, especially smaller trials really inform how the science is developed, especially at the beginning of the life of the therapeutic. And you see this a lot with CAR Ts, for example. CAR Ts are these immunotherapies for cancer. um, Many of the initial trials, many of the initial experiments that showed how CAR Ts worked, and did like the little engineering tweaks to like make them better, happened in like very small samples of people, like 5 people. This was not like a huge clinical trial, and then it was just like a small academic trial. And then what people did is they iterated upon that to produce better therapies. And if you look at like the most successful therapies, they actually emerged from this process of clinical evolution where people did a small experiment, then they got feedback from the patient, and then they integrated with the science. And that it's much better than just, starting this like whole clinical trial enterprise with 1,000 people and like, you know, failing. So I really think that by conflating like smaller sort of trials with like, the sort of final ones, um, we really like contribute to this idea that trials and like in human data is like something completely separate from like the sort of process of scientific discovery, and they're like 2 separate processes. You can either improve, the basic science at the start, or you can improve the clinical trials, and that's it. No, I think they're just much more of a feedback loop, and that's exactly what China is doing in this, and by the way, and why they're doing so great. So yeah, so I think this is like a very big sort of blind spot. I think people are underestimating the sort of role that like in human data has, and the way in which it functions through feedback loops with science, and how we should aim to iterate as much as possible.
Yeah, you pointed something very important. You're saying that sort of the official clinical trials that get you market approval by the FDA, but also by other regulators in other parts of the world, because almost anyone else has adopted the same model, is not the same thing or doesn't directly overlap with the process of scientific discovery,
Yeah.
right? So in fact, that actually imposes kind of one model or one barrier kind of on everyone before commercialization. Right. So, and there's historical reasons for that. I want to unpack a bit the first principles reasons. Like, should it be done this way? How could it be done in different ways? We want to kind of see why. And this is like really for the listener who has heard about this for the first time. Why do we do these trials? right? Because we want to we want to have drugs and therapies that, treat cancer, Alzheimer diseases, and all sorts of things. And we want to know if they're safe and if we want to know that they work. Right, so phase 1 basically is safety, and phase 2 is a mix of a little bit of safety and efficacy, and phase 3 is like a big kahuna efficacy randomized control gold standard study. Right, that's kind of the idea, right? And then we can release it to the public, then people can use it, right? So, what's the problem with that idea that there is sort of this one big step that's so expensive before it's released to the public that takes 10 years?
Yeah, so I want to, I haven't thought that much about like how the whole system can be revamped, but I want to give an example of like the potential for revamping it in a more radical way in terms of like, changing the structure of how you, even allow drugs to be approved and so on. I want to give an example of just to ground people in like the current reality and like sort of why something like that could potentially work. So again, I'm going to go back to again. So the reason why we have phase 3 trials or sometimes phase 2, depending on like exactly the therapeutic area, is again, like you have phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3, and usually phase 3 is like a big randomized control trial. And what you usually want to show there is that your therapy works in like a sort of very controlled environment, so that you don't have confounders and so on. That's why it's randomized, and it's really such that you don't first of all, that's so that we know for a lot of drugs whether they work or not, because not for everything you can, for some things you can sort of like infer from like clinical usage whether they work or not. Like there's this whole thing of like off-label drug discovery where like doctors observe whether things work or not, but especially for a drug that's tested in an indication for the first time, you just usually want to like see whether you just want to have the ground truth of whether it works or not. And in many cases, randomized controlled trials are just like the best way of doing so. And so basically the sort of, for various historical reasons and like regulatory reasons and so on, we have converged upon this like sequence of events, like phase 1, safety. It's usually small. If it doesn't work, then you just drop the program. If not, you go to phase 2, which is usually a combination of efficacy and of safety. In cancer, it can sometimes be used for approval, for accelerated approval. And in other diseases, I bet phase 2 can also be used for approval. And then phase 3 is just like the big confirmatory one, maybe multiple trials where you really show how efficacious they are. And then on the base of that, you have approval. Now, I think that this is like a sort of system created by humans. And I want to give an example of how, again, how the first therapy for the first CAR T therapy, Kymriah, was approved. So it was approved in 2017, and it was approved for this very severe type of cancer, BALL. So it was like a cancer of the B cells, which are part of blood, and it was sort of like it was specifically for like young people who had it. So like I think people under 25. And just remind everyone, now with CAR Ts, we actually have, like, we can actually basically cure entire types of blood cancer. Not in everyone, but like we have very, like, they are curative and like, relapse cancer, so cancer that is coming back, like things that we would have never believed. But, the first type of like CAR T therapy to be approved was Kymriah in 2017. And this is like basically you take the immune cells and you engineer them a bit, and then you make them attack the cancer. So really smart idea. But if you look back at like, so this was because of a phase 2 study, quite, I think it was advanced by Novartis, but definitely by a big pharma. And it was done in partnership with with academic collaborators, University of Pennsylvania. Now, if you look back and if you trace back where this comes from, you see that the same researchers 5 years earlier had tested this therapy in a very much smaller sample of people in this sort of academic trial. I think it was maybe N of 5, like 5 people. And they had done, again, like a sort of small modification of this therapy based on they were clinicians, and they were clinicians who were also researchers, so doctors. And they basically did a small tweak. They added this co-stimulatory domain based on observations that they had from another small trial that they organize. Again, this is this like a phase 1, phase 2? It's just like a small experiment in humans where really they were looking for both efficacy and safety and everything. It wasn't really split by phase 1, like safety, efficacy. They wanted to get as much information as possible. And that N of 5 couldn't have sustained an FDA approval, but it really produced proof of principle that this was something that was worth doing and that there's little tweaking would work. And if they had to find funding for like a big phase 2 trial, and if it wasn't cancer, they would have had to have a phase 3 trial. Like they would have, because cancer just allows you for various reasons you can get approval for like phase 2. And they wouldn't have really gotten that funding. So the fact that they were able to iterate in smaller samples of people and do these like small trials and sort of really get feedback from human data, not from like mice from in vitro models, was really valuable. And I do wonder what would have happened if this was not possible, or if this model didn't exist, and what would happen if this usually happens in academia. It's much harder to do it within a biotech, to have these cycles of improvement within human data. But this shows how important it is to have these feedback loops. And it does make me wonder if there are other ways of like organizing this system to be more adaptive, to be more, instead of having like the sort of staggered 1, 2, 3, which again is the major way in which private companies are doing things. If there is a way to be more adaptive, if there is a way to incorporate, to do it a bit differently and still to get efficacy at the end. But I am not an expert in that part. I'm more interested in how can you do more of like, how can you make things easier within the current system, and how can we make more of these smaller trials. And I'm also interested in how you can actually like how you can do more of this iteration, because it clearly can happen. But I do think that this shows that there is possibility for something that is a bit more flexible.
Yeah. I have many things to say what I think about the current clinical trial system, but was wondering about your thoughts on two ideas. One just came to me actually. I think safety and efficacy might be a bit of a misnomer, right? The actual thing we're looking for is risk reward, right? Because, safety, what is it? There's no absolute safety, right? There's, when you do a chemotherapy, it's not safe, right? It has severe side effects and downsides, right? But it has a certain level of reward, right? So, I think it's a bit legacy, right? In the beginning, there was just safety, but then the FDA said, like, we don't have absolute proof of safety, right? Nothing is completely safe, but it really depends on what you get from it. And that's why they introduced efficacy trials in the first place, which wasn't an entirely unjustifiable argument, if you think about it. But then the problem is, if efficacy is like a barrier for market approval, like efficacy is much harder to prove in many ways than at least some of the basics of safety, like toxicology and things like that. So if that then becomes a huge barrier, it increases the cost a lot for all the trials and for anything to get to market. And that means that a lot of drugs are uneconomic to develop, right? Because they help too few people, or because they would be sort of a one shot and they would cure you right away instead of having something like recurring, right? So it skews the market in a certain way to like the situation we have right now, where it's basically only blockbuster drugs that make sense to develop to recoup the very high development costs. But I was wondering what you think, A, of that risk reward idea, and B, also, should efficacy, or at least phase 3 gold standard randomized controlled trial efficacy, be a condition for pre-market approval? Should we just remove that altogether? Just simple, it's like that.
Yeah, so that's a very good point. So I will say maybe for the audience, just to put this a bit in context, you mentioned one concept, which is the fact that most drugs are not really economic to make. So just to remind everyone that even among the very few drugs that get approved, I think only 50% of them recoup their R&D investments. So like they're not even like even a success is not actually usually profitable. And really what drives the industry is these like blockbuster drugs. So you have like this very fat tail distribution of drug success. So really it's much worse than the 10% figure might suggest. But it also does show how different the sort of in vitro and like the sort of preclinical models are from in humans. Because like, we something that we're even worse at predicting is like how impactful something will be. Like, for example, GLP-1 agonists. Nobody's like at the beginning they were developed for diabetes. They were just going to be another diabetes cure. Nobody thought that I mean, people had signs, but like they were not primarily developed for obesity. So yeah, so just to say that this is like a very, very high risk, very high stakes endeavor, and most things don't just fail, but most things also just don't make money. Like even the things that don't fail, they a lot of the time they don't make money, they don't make economic sense. So yeah, so to your point, if you do happen to be lucky and make something that works, you will have as a person who commercializes, as an entity that commercializes it, you will have a period of market exclusivity, which is given by your patent. And that's when you have to recoup a lot of the costs. And a lot of the times no, very often the trials eat into that market exclusivity because your patent is usually is usually granted before you finish your trials. And even if that was not the case, so that's one reason because it eats into your patent. But even if that was not the case, there are certain conditions, like even if your patent was granted after you finish the trials for aging, who wants to organize to measure aging? You basically have to organize like, I don't know how many billions of dollars you'd have in a trial. So like even if you had like all the market exclusivity in the world, people would still not pursue it just because the upfront investment is so high. And also with a very high uncertainty that it will work. That's another thing. So but basically when you measure efficacy, and if you have like very hard measure of efficacy, you are basically going to prolong the sort of duration of the trials, and as opposed to just safety. So for example, in osteoporosis is a very good example. Is you have to measure fractures because it's a disease of like weakening the bones, and you get fractures, and measuring fractures is just very hard. Like showing reduction in fractures, you need a lot of patience. Fractures are quite they're not like a very frequent event. You basically need trials that cost 1 billion because of like the sample size that you need and because of the duration. And this distorts what diseases people invest in. So there is economic literature showing that within cancer therapeutics, people invest more in cancers where people live less. And so like with lower survival, just lower survival, because they can measure a reduction in mortality like faster. So it doesn't eat into your patent, into your commercialization time. And often this might sound good because
Crazy.
no,
Because
there
the sort of listeners were catching that, right? So the process kind of makes people develop less effective cancer drugs because it's easier to prove, right? Or easier to get past the hurdle.
so it makes them develop drugs in areas where patients already live less.
Mm-mm.
So basically, there are some cancer where the survival time is longer, like 5 years, and some cancer where the survival time is lower, like less than 5 years. And people crowd to areas where the survival time is already lower. So you could say this is a good thing because, we're treating more aggressive cancers. But usually, what happens is that you often also have more marginal improvements. And in any case, I don't think that we should distort I don't think we should only try to cure diseases that are killing us in like 2 years because we can measure the effect they have. Like this massively distorts what ends up getting invested in. So this is why we don't have a lot of people always talk about like we don't have therapies for chronic diseases. Like osteoporosis is one example where and we're like for cancers where you might survive for a longer amount of time. And one reason why we don't have them is because having to measure efficacy then distorts the incentives and makes people want to be able to crouch to places where you can show a benefit very easily. And one way to solve this is surrogate endpoints. So basically, surrogate endpoints are measures that stand in for clinical benefits. So instead of measuring like waiting for people to develop like literally like basically like to measure how many people to reduction in mortality, which you have to wait for a long time, you measure like some sort of like something called a biomarker that correlates with that thing that you actually want, that you actually care about. So that supports like some sort of provisional approval or sometimes full approval, depending on how well validated a surrogate endpoint is. Now, nobody has incentives to develop these surrogate endpoints because you can't really commercialize them, and it takes very. I've done actually I have an entire investigation on this. It takes very long to pass them. They also have to go through a regulatory process, and it gets very long to submit them. So like we actually have very few new surrogate endpoints, even though there's a lot of research on biomarkers in academia. And at the same time, we do actually rely on a lot of bad ones that are kind of like inherited historically that nobody wants to get rid of, because if we got rid of them, then people will stop developing drugs. So it's all like very distorted equilibrium that we're in. So yeah, so I think all of this to say is that like having to measure efficacy is a major, like, does distort the market and what gets invested in the first place a lot. And the distortion in incentives is really important, something people don't talk a lot about. And you can solve this in various ways. Again, with one technology developing surrogate endpoint, that isn't really happening, unfortunately. People aren't really developing them. Another one is to just measure safety and then allow drugs on the market and then let people use them if they think they're useful or not. I think that I personally am interested in this idea. I have a lot of questions around how this would end up showing up in like all sorts of like insurance, reimbursement. And it would be also very interesting to basically develop a way to like potentially measure post approval, like, because we do at the end of the day want to find out if the drugs work or not. So something that I'm interested about in this proposal is how would someone be able to get a ground truth, allow the drugs on the market, people buy them. Who would reimburse them on the basis of what? And then how do you check if they work or not? And I personally don't really have good answers for this, but I'm really interested in what other people have to say.
Yeah, I think that would be a proposal that I think would be probably easy and straightforward to argue for, right? To scrap phase 3 as a condition for pre-market approval, but sort of make it the condition to access like public insurance schemes and things like that, right? And there's a lot of details to figure out how exactly that looks like, as you say. But one thing I wanted to point out in regards to like phase 3 is, doesn't the existence of off-label kind of prove or show that you don't need phase 3 efficacy trials for a somewhat functioning market where patient and clinicians can kind of coordinate to figure out what works and what doesn't? Like, yes, we don't know it perfectly, sure, right? But, we have a lot of drugs out there. So off-label means it's been approved for one indication. Say, you mentioned GLP-1s approved for diabetes, but it might work for other things. Like lots of drugs don't only work on one thing, they work on other things. But, the FDA is just like one drug, one disease model, right? It's approved for that. But so the company can't market it for anything else than what it's approved for. But doctors and clinicians can say, hey, this drug that's approved for whatever, we try it out on something else. And that's what we call off-label. And it's quite common. I think something like 30 or 40% of drugs or medications that are in use are off-label. And these have not been through a phase 3 efficacy trial. So we don't have like the ground truth or whatever, but it doesn't mean that that we don't have no information, right? So I was wondering if you have any response to that.
Yeah. So I think that I definitely think that that's a real thing. And I think people should, again, like I would like to read more about this. I'm aware of these results. I believe them, but I haven't really had time to like read so deeply into like the off-label stuff and exactly what it looks like. One reaction that I have is these are drugs that have already shown efficacy in one disease. And I think it's much more likely that, so for example, autoimmune diseases have like certain mechanisms in common. So if you're successful in one autoimmune disease, you're much more likely to be successful in another one than like just a random drug. So I think that the quality of the drugs that have already been approved for one disease is higher than just like a random drug that doesn't show efficacy in anything. The other thing is I don't know exactly how the off-label, like how this gets like actually like how does this happen and how do doctors just like collectively decide this works. I think it's a very interesting thing. But something that I think would be really cool would be if we could like somehow standardize this more in the sense of like are there ways in which you can like carry out like real world clinical trials where you just use the data from doctors, like you allow a drug on the market and then you use the data that doctors have in a way that like allows you to infer something about the drug that isn't like um you know from a randomized control trials. And from my investigation so far on like people trying to do meta-analysis, for example, to validate surrogate endpoints, this is very hard to do because of a lot of like legal and regulatory reasons. So a lot of this data is just very hard. It's not in a unified portal. It's not accessible. So for example, for the osteoporosis case where they tried to qualify bone mineral density, they spent 6 years just collating data because from trials in osteoporosis because it was just scattered across pharma companies. So we really are underutilizing the data that we have in a massive way because of like all sorts of like operational, legal, regulatory reasons. And somebody should figure out like, I'm trying to do that, but I'm just one person. So I think more people should like figure out what is blocking this. But that's one thought that I have is like, how do you make more use of data? And maybe you know more than me about like how this works and how feasible it would be to sort of do it more wide scale. But it's definitely something that those are my first two reactions. First of all, the higher quality of like drugs that have been approved for one indication for efficacy, and whether you could do something where you just based on this where you just allow more of like where once something has shown efficacy in something you make it easier for other trials or you don't
Mm.
require something like that. And the second thought is whether you could how do you make more use of the data and like how do you actually find out from real world usage whether something works or not.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know that much about it, but from sort of superficial reading, it seems that there is a market for repurposing drugs, right? There's a company called EveryCure that has like 14 different assets that they've been actively like trialing and repurposing for other things. I read that the market for repurposing is actually like something like 30 to 40 billion. It's not small. Um, there might be barriers such as like, all right, you can't patent it, obviously, right? So there's not a huge M&A acquisition market afterwards for drugs, right? Because it's not patented. That could be one reason. Not sure if you can market it. Like, can you market a drug that you repurpose? I think clinicians can give it to their patients, right? But they can't like do TV ads or whatever about it. But it kind of shows, like, even without sort of the gold standard phase 3 plus then you have marketing, patent protection, whatever, even then a market can develop and it's this very disadvantaged market, right? So and this, yeah, and it works, right? There is not big barriers. There might be some more barriers we can do away with, but then repurposing could be a very interesting industry.
Yeah, I mean, I also there's this I definitely think that I'm a big believer in like sort of I used to be more skeptical of this, but I'm now much more enthusiastic about bro science or like people who are
Bro
experimenting.
science.
Bro science, it's like
Yeah.
all these so my mantra is basically in human data beats everything because I feel like it's a very empiricist approach to drug discovery. um I know, like, I just think we have seen so many drugs that are blockbusters, which people develop for something else, and then they turn out to be good for something. And like Viagra is an example, GLP-1 agonists, statins, even statins were like almost statins for cardiovascular disease. They were almost like abandoned. So in human data. And bro science is like basically these bodybuilders who inject themselves all sorts of peptides, and they're so obsessive about like recording their sort of like biohacking. Like basically they're so obsessed about like recording their body states that like they I know people who follow them and like they have basically sort of collectively in some way of rise of some decent conclusions. And I would really like to sort of see more of how can we how can we systematize bro science? How can we like I have so many friends who inject themselves with like all sorts of Chinese peptides. People like the Chinese pep means just means peptides from the black market, like, you know, coming from China with no like before approval. Like, you know, a very good example to your point is that there's this new drug, retrotrutide. Anyway, there's this new drug that from Eli Lilly on obesity, but also I think preserved muscle mass. It hasn't yet been approved by the FDA. I think the phase 3 trial results have just come out. But like people are injecting themselves with it from like sort of, you know, in the form of so-called Chinese peptides. And I know people who do that. And it's probably riskier than if they just had it available in some shape or form. They started doing that before the phase 3 results were out. And my question is if there's this appetite in people, and there definitely is, and if this data is so valuable, is there a way in which you can take advantage of this and like sort of link these people in some way and like sort of make this more formal? Because I'm also sure that there's a lot of like you know, we all know about the supplement stuff and like people thinking that they have cured their cancer with some sort of weird herb. But I also think there is a real signal, especially in these communities that are very like results driven, like the bodybuilding community, like the sort of, yeah, the bro science community. And like, I am very interested in how you could basically formalize that in some sense and gather data from all sorts of things, like, you know, any monitoring devices and so on.
Yeah. I think that kind of goes to the heart of what I think is the problem and also to much of your writing, right? The problem is not like, as some might think, all right, the FDA doesn't approve enough drugs or whatever, right? The problem is that we don't have enough ways or the ways in which we translate science into something that can enter the market and the clinic, into drugs that people can take. It's just too expensive. And sort of what some people perceive as rigor is actually preventing alternative ways of collecting data, of doing science and things like that, which actually prevents rigor in some ways. Like it prevents us from like more iteration, more sort of iterative or adaptive trial designs. You know, I think also there is just many types of trials that are just like not allowed, even though they can be very effective, like human challenge trials, which is something that was discussed a lot during COVID. Like it obviously doesn't make sense for everything. But, you know, for the official RCTs for the COVID vaccine, you could probably had like I think 1,000 times more efficiency or 100 times more efficiency in like the number of trial participants you would have needed to get to the same statistical robustness, right? So the problem is, okay, we have this one system that's supposed to be very rigorous, but it isn't rigor to not allow a bunch of really good science and data to help us figure out what works and what doesn't.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can imagine. I'm a very big fan of human challenge trials. I'm working with Josh Morrison from One Day Sooner, who's like a proponent of them. So human challenge trials are basically when people basically you are intentionally exposing. It's usually for like sort of infectious disease. You're intentionally exposing yourself to a pathogen, and then you are giving the person a vaccine for it, or like, well, yeah, or like you first you give them a vaccine and then you expose them. I don't know exactly what the sequence is. I assume it varies based on like whether it's a vaccine or a treatment. But anyway, the point is you're intentionally exposing someone to it. So basically, instead of like waiting for someone to get COVID, you just give them COVID. And people have like this weird like sort of ick. They get the ick. Get an aversion to this idea. Well, it does make trials much more efficient because you don't have to wait for people to get a disease. And realistically speaking, most people did get COVID, and especially, I'm not suggesting that people should like, you know, give themselves AIDS on purpose, or like HIV should infect themselves with like really dangerous viruses on purpose. But we have a lot of diseases that, you know, we have, we yeah, you will either probably get it or you will or like we know that vaccines like treatments work, and like a better treatment like is very likely to work. And I think that there is, you know, also from like a personal freedom kind of perspective, I don't like the idea of like people being blocked, because this is like a voluntary, so like people in, you know, inject themselves, like sort of expose themselves voluntarily. Nobody forces you. Um, and I think that, it saves so many lives to bring, especially during a pandemic like COVID, like to bring drugs to market faster. It just can save so many lives. And to block that because of some sort of like weird moral thing, like I don't think, if you do the maths, I don't think that actually human challenge trials lead to any counterfactual death to some extent, like because like all these people, like everyone got COVID anyway. And like even if there are two principles here. Like first of all, like I think people should have the choice, like even if you wanted to give yourself HIV, I think you should be allowed to. I think I see sort of issues with that because I think that some people can be coerced and some people can be sort of influenced by certain circumstances and like really bad sort of types of virus. So we could restrict it to just like really, really like more mild diseases, especially in young people like COVID. But it's a personal freedom angle. But then there's also like the angle of like, we really have infectious disease where basically everyone gets it. So it makes no sense to like restrict people from voluntarily getting their virus. So I think there's like just two layers of like,
Yeah.
you know, paternalism.
And in one of the first episodes on this podcast, Jessica Flanagan pointed out something interesting, right? So you're letting people take a risk voluntarily on behalf of others. That's very heroic. And you know who else did that during COVID? It was doctors and nurses, right?
Yeah.
So they were voluntarily exposing themselves to a risk they were extremely much higher, like almost certain to get COVID, right? Because they were treating and helping people. So that's is kind of what would be the same thing if you would voluntarily contract COVID as part of a human challenge trial. So shouldn't that be like seen as a heroic, desirable thing? Um, but anyway, so we were thinking of kind of the kinds of innovation that sort of the clinical trial landscape could take. You and your writings take kind of a very engineering approach, like to the different phases and different initiatives and how we could really improve outcomes there and make sort of that whole pipeline more iterative and cheaper and getting better data out of it. Out of all your writings or your thoughts in the last couple of weeks or months, what do you think right now are kind of the most impactful while feasible potential initiatives, right? So there's some people right now in the administration that are probably aligned with some of these ideas. I know one of your co-authors is part of HHS, of the Clinical Trial Abundance Project. So which ones, if you could choose like, say, two or three, do you think are the highest impact while potentially feasible if we do them like in the next 1 or 2 years?
Yeah. So one of the things that I'm really excited about, and it's more of a philanthropic initiative actually, is I proposed it and we got some initial funding, is uh buying these regulatory filings from companies that go bankrupt. And these regulatory filings contain all the details about the clinical development process and also the FDA correspondence, and then sort of open sourcing them. The reason I'm super excited about that is because I think one of the biggest drivers of inefficiency is not even regulation per se, but regulatory opacity. So people are very slow, for example, to adopt certain, innovative clinical trial designs, like what you talked about, adaptive trials, not because the FDA doesn't allow it theoretically, but because they don't know. They are afraid that the FDA might say something bad, and they don't know how to implement it, and they don't know how regulators will react. So we have this like basically really risk averse industry, and it particularly hurts new entrants. That's another problem, even though smaller biotechs are now the primary drivers of innovation. So what I really hope to do with this is to basically create like a sort of um like regulatory know-how for the commons, I call it. So like that people can see for themselves, what does the clinical trial process look like? What does the clinical development process look like? What does the FDA say about different things? And I want to say that these things are not available at all because they're protected by trade secrets. Most people who start a biotech, they've never seen a full submission to the FDA. And these have thousands of pages. They have a lot of information. I have two on my laptop now. They've never seen correspondence with the FDA. I think that's pretty crazy. And I think that it basically creates regulatory capture and it makes everything less efficient. So our solution is to do this via bankruptcy. But it would be really nice if you, I mean, we're also pursuing that at like a policy level, if you could increase the level of like basically FDA transparency, but then also like in a more exhaustive way through like legal changes and policy changes. And you would basically need legal changes. So basically we CRL, so complete response letters, are these summary like these judgments that the FDA makes at the end. And they're increasingly released by the FDA. They're being redacted. People are very excited about it. But there's something like a tenth or less than these documents that we want to release. And really and people are still very excited because people want anything, any information they can get out of what the FDA wants. And I think that there are mechanisms to release some of these CDDs. CDDs are these long regulatory documents, especially from older companies. Like now, even something 40 years ago off patent, you don't have access to it. Clinical trial results, clinical trial specifications, all of this, it will require like sort of legal change. And obviously it needs to be very, like I'm working on this now, it needs to be very, very well thought out. You don't want to like disincentivize investment. You don't want to like, mess up with like real trade secrets and so on. But I do think that there is a lot of potential there. So, just increasing the transparency of the regulatory process is very important. A lot of risk aversion because people don't know what to expect. And it just like creates like this race to the bottom. So that's one thing. I think the second thing is and also
And
and to
before you go
understand.
to the second thing, maybe just a quick summary also from my side to make sure every listener understands that, because I was actually also very excited about that proposal, right? So the FDA, the company corresponds with the FDA with like the data that they have from like animal and preclinical studies, and also results from phase 1 studies, I think were part of it. And then the FDA says, yeah,
manufacturing processes, phase 1,
manufacturing,
2, phase
yeah.
3, trial design, literally everything that you do that has to be approved by the FDA, which is most things, is in there.
Exactly. And that knowledge is not that easy to get to. It's not all explicitly laid out by the FDA. And like what the FDA said to other companies is largely inaccessible, right? Because of trade secrets, right? That's something you've written about, like why the FDA can't release that data, right? So there's a lot of very valuable information for like another company that wants to know why another company it wasn't approved by the FDA, or what the FDA wants from that company, because your company could be kind of similar, right? So you'd have just much more information that otherwise you'd have to pay like a lot of lawyers for, or lobbyists that would give you that knowledge or that access. And also having meetings with the FDA costs you money, right? And takes you time to schedule that meeting. That's like a runway for your startup. So what if you had that information, and your proposal was really, really clever, saying, all right, there is companies that failed, and they're now in bankruptcy courts or auctions, and you could just buy them, and then you could get access to that to that paper trail and open source that and make it accessible, which I found really exciting and brilliant.
Yes, and we have actually, yeah, that's a good summary. And I would also add, because a lot of people are like, okay, but those are companies, they failed. It means they did something wrong. A lot of companies fail because of execution, but also we don't want to, what we're interested in is not to take these drugs forward. We don't care if the drug is good or not, right? Like you can advance a crappy drug through the clinical trial process. As long as what we're interested in is to create knowledge of the process and all of these, like if a company has designed a trial that was accepted by the FDA, it means they have succeeded in one respect. And we want to understand how they designed the trial such that the FDA allowed them to go forward, how they designed, what preclinical models they had, and what did the FDA say about them. That's why we want to open source. It's not about like, we don't necessarily think maybe that happens, maybe that doesn't. We don't necessarily think that we'll have like, these amazing drugs that will be surfaced and like that nobody knew about. No, because probably if there were amazing drugs in there, people would bid higher than we do. We really just want knowledge of the process so that people who have amazing drugs are not like failing because they can't take their stuff through the FDA and don't know the process. And we actually got initial money for this, and we're going to start. We have a lawyer with One Day Sooner, Josh, who is like a very big partner here in challenge trials. You can donate if you want to. So we're nonprofit, so we're not like it's exciting, and we already have 2 that were donated. Also, if you want to donate CDDs as well, these documents, please donate them. And yeah, so
Best DM, Twitter DM you, or how can people find you that want to donate?
so I am at, yeah, I'm on Twitter, Ruxandra Teslo, and I'm also on Substack at Ruxandra Teslo. So you can either DM me on Twitter or on Substack. I'm also at, uh, yeah, I'm either Twitter or Substack is good. So, also LinkedIn. I'm also on LinkedIn. So, that would also be good. We'll create like an official page where people can email us and so on. This is just getting started, but yeah, in the meantime, just contact me. And yeah, so that's one idea. The second idea would be, um, I think that I haven't written this down yet, but I think that a close look at the Australian phase one system is really warranted. So they are basically able to get into phase one trials much faster. And again, I really have this preference for like early small trials where you can get quick readouts. And the reason why they have that is because they don't, in order to advance the drug into humans, you don't actually have to submit an entire application to their FDA. I don't actually know who their regulator is. You just have to get ethical approval, and they have like a very different ethical approval system that sort of plays well into that. They have like a centralized IRB system. In the US, the IRB institutional review boards are decentralized and creates a lot of problems. But anyway, the point is that they also have like relaxed manufacturing requirements for phase one because it's much more bespoke. So a really just like, and obviously like you don't hear about people just like constantly dying in trials in Australia. I mean, the reason why I'm giving Australia is just because there are many there are other countries where this happens, but people always say like, oh, but like it's really dangerous and whatnot. I mean, I haven't heard. I mean, there there isn't any additional danger. We just shows, and they advance something like 40%, 50% faster, and this really shows how much we're living on the table for no like particularly good risk reason. So I think that just taking their model and trying to adapt it as much as possible to the US, just like a very easy win. I also am going to put out some proposal relating to institutional review boards, which are slowing down research at a lot of institutions. Um, I think there's a very big problem that researchers can only use institutional review boards at their own institution, and that creates like almost like a capture where I've heard people being delayed for 2 years and a half for trying to do analysis on a cancer sample. So there wasn't even a patient. It was just like an existing piece of tissue that they wanted to analyze, that they had to wait 2 years and a half through all these rounds of ethical review. Horrible. And the problem is that you can't go to another. There are these independent IRBs that control a lot of the industry trials. You can't do that as a researcher. You have to use your university's IRB, and you're basically dependent. And we all know how administration and admin and like bureaucracy proliferates in universities. So if you happen to be in a university with a problem with this, you just basically have to wait for a very long time to get your study started for like really silly reasons. So IRBs. So I propose that basically you should have IRB choice. Like
Mhm.
you just go, yeah. As
Amazing.
long
Yeah.
as
So
we have these like third bodies, nonprofit. There's nonprofit HRPP, which basically gives like accreditation, extra accreditation beyond what the federal regulations need to like IRBs, so that you make sure that you don't, contract like a bad one and so on.
yeah. Um, Now this proposal 2 and 3 actually pretty closely intersect with the work that I'm doing currently, right? So on the Australia phase one, called the CTN pathway, right? So as you correctly mentioned, Australia has a much faster way to do phase one trials. They require a 75-page submission or registration of the IND filing as opposed to 1,000 that the FDA requires. And again, as you mentioned, these are done as rigorously, and you don't hear about bad things that happen in Australia. Australia is now actually hailed as a big innovator in clinical trials and also in manufacturing for various different reasons. So when it comes to regulation in sort of credible developed countries, Australia is a major innovator in biotech. Now, I've talked actually to an industry group, not going to name any names, but they have far more resources and, billions of dollars of assets under management. And they actually tried to lobby the FDA with that proposal. And guess what? It didn't work, right? So
Why?
because
Okay.
because they tried. This is the way they do it. I think there's another way to do it, but when you try bottom up, like everyone is risk averse, right? And you talk to that department, department, or whatever, right? So it just doesn't work like that. So um, you need to go if you want to change anything. It only works top down, but then there's limited kind of political capital with the administration, and then with any administration, you're tied kind of to a political project very often that can backfire when you're the next administration. So long story short, I think in general, it's just like almost impossible to lobby or to get changes for the right things, unfortunately, which is partly why I'm in Prospera, right? Because there we can redesign things from scratch, really improve it works and sort of show by doing what's possible. But I think there's actually one narrow pathway in the United States through which that kind of innovation and sort of bringing in the Australia model could work, which is through states, right? So I've worked actually on the next New Hampshire bill or proposed some changes that might allow sort of these kind of Australia style importing phase one style Australia CTN regulations, right? So basically American federalism gives states more autonomy to set their own regulations, right? So of course they can't replace the FDA and all of that, and there's all sorts of nuances, but it's something that could work. It's something that we're now did with Montana and with New Hampshire, and there's just less political capital required to kind of let the states just do their thing. There's also like Utah and Florida with like stem cell laws and things like that. So I think there's kind of a narrow pathway, right? So the original idea of laboratories of governance at the state side in the United States, that's kind of what I'm currently working on.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, I also think, just to riff on that, I think the other thing is like, I believe before making, I think these things are very under discussed, and like I think that it's in some sense people, I think it's even harder to propose something that nobody knows why it's like, yeah, like I don't know exactly how this works in practice, but I imagine that I think that it would help if people were at least more aware of the importance of clinical trials, but I think that people often don't really make the connection, and I think it's much harder to advocate and like create political buy-in if someone just says like, if someone just expends their political capital on an idea that you as a group knows is good but nobody else knows is good, and like why would they spend their political capital on that, right? Like it's not a popular proposal. Like I also think it's good to make these things more popular so that people are more incentivized to spend their political capital on it.
Yeah. I mean, what could work now maybe is the China angle, right? Because basically clinical trials and much of that is now going to China, and that's not
Yeah.
something I think many people in the current or future administration want.
Yeah.
Yeah. But anyway, is there, or are you thinking about things in a way where you like, this would be kind of an ideal or better system if you had like the full ability to start a system of clinical trials or of regulatory approval of biomedical innovation from scratch if you didn't have the legacy constraints in the United States? I'm asking because, you can actually do that, right? So I live in Prospera, and, any good ideas that you might have, we could actually implement right away.
I would have to think about this, but like I would do phase ones like Australia. I would I would, yeah, that would be like a very obvious one. Straight away. Yeah.
Mhm. Australia phase ones, human challenge trials, obviously.
Human farm trials, yes, much more choice, more like allowing people to choose for themselves. Yeah. Uh,
Mhm.
less like I would do an opt-in privacy. Like I think we're, like the whole HIPAA stuff doesn't like if people want to protect their data, yes, but like people in practice show that they don't care about their data. Like when you make them pay, they don't. It's a complicated topic, but basically, I think that we need to be much more. I would personally allow my health data to be analyzed, and I think that like I don't even know how to opt in for that because I think it's much more important than like whatever whether they're gonna discover with it. I'm like I
Mhm.
don't know.
Fantastic. Ruxandra, we covered a lot of ground today. You've been very generous with your time, very insightful. Really looking forward and hoping to stay connected on some of these topics because, as I mentioned, I'm working some of them practically, and your writing is, I think, really by far the most um, practical and valuable. Like here's actual and concrete things we can do. Like big kudos to you. I am really been really, really impressed with your writing. So thanks so
What?
much for coming on. And
Generous. I also good luck with everything, and yeah, we should stay in touch. And yeah, very
for
exciting.
sure. So any other shout out you want to give or drive people's attention towards? So how can they find you? Like you mentioned already, the donations part for the open sourcing review data.
Yeah, Ruxandra Teslo on Twitter, Ruxandra Teslo also on Substack, and yeah, I also write for I write for Institute for Progress. So follow that for their biotech section. I also write for various publications, and I usually post that on on Twitter or on Substack. And I think just in general, we're probably like I'm gonna spend more time on this, and we're gonna probably try and like do more things. I mean, definitely, but I don't have like another like very concrete project until like apart from the transparency one. I do think that in general, I want to raise more money. I think more people should be working on this, just defining the problems. Um, I just have like my hands full, so like if there's very few people who are like sort of doing the work of like looking across biotech and like what are the problems. Even if you ask like investors and so on, they don't all know like what is a regulatory problem, what is a scientific problem, what is a integration problem. Everyone kind of knows their own sort of niche, which makes sense. But I do think that we just need more people to like even define what the problems are, and it's just quite complicated because you need to like go across law and like interview a lot of people and like integrate information in a way that's just kind of time consuming. So I do hope to grow the sort of like topic, so to speak, because I think it's going to become more and more important, especially with, as you mentioned, China.
Amazing. Ruxandra, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me, and have a nice even for me it's evening, for you it's day.
Midday. Yeah. Thanks.
Midday. Thank you so much.